Code Please.
Welcome to Code Please. In this channel, I try to teach you a little bit about computer programming using the Elixir language. If you find this content useful, please consider subscribing and sharing with your friends. Now let's get into today's video. Hi guys, welcome to another episode of our Honest Chat series. And before we start, I would like to leave this disclaimer. You might have noticed that I haven't been writing any tests for the project. And although I am a strong apologist that projects should have tests because it helps maintain your code and make sure that everything is working properly as you expect it to, I just don't want to spend the time doing that. I might do a special video on how to test in Elixir and Phoenix, but for now we're just gonna have to live without tests. And also would like to leave a note about Credo and Sobilo, which are a couple of libraries. One that checks your code against best practices in the Elixir community, things like code complexity or where you are using some code that could be done in a slightly simpler way or more clear. Basically, any guidelines that your common linter would give you, you can get with Credo. And then Sobilo is basically a library that checks your Phoenix application for security vulnerabilities, which is also very good to have. So we're going to add those in the course of this episode. So in this episode, we are going to set up a bit our layout and also create the ability for a user to click on the sidebar on a room and be able to update the messages pane with the room information about that room. And one final note, the UI that we're going to have, we're not going to build it from scratch because that would be just too much work and I'm not a designer. So we are going to go to this website here, Tailwind components, where we can have access to a bunch of components that people have already designed and submitted. So we're going to steal, quote unquote, this design for a login page, for instance. And we're going to do the same for like a Slack clone. That's kind of the thing we're going for in our Honest Chat application. And you can use this site. There's more sites with Tailwind components that you can basically reuse. It's super easy. You see the component that you like, and then you just click show code, and you can see the entire code that builds up this using Tailwind. So you just copy paste and then adapt for exchanging the pieces of information that you need to exchange. And apart from this one, there's also Tailwind UI, which is a paid set of components designed by the guy that actually developed Tailwind CSS. But they have like a bunch of free samples that you can get from there. So things like a navigation bar or some cards or, there's a bunch of components that you can also get from here for free. And if you feel like going in a different direction with your UI for the Honest Chat application, please go right ahead. So let's get started. So the first things I want to do here is, for one, I want to update my version of LiveView, because in the meantime, there's been a new version 17.4, which brings a bunch of new goodies, including the ability to call JavaScript client code from the server using a new JS module, which is pretty cool. So we'll just update LiveView to 0.17.4. And I also want to add Credo and Sobilo here as dependencies. So just like so. And let's go into our console and do mix-deps.get or mix-deps.update -- all, which will also make sure that LiveView gets upgraded. And yeah, this should have no immediate effect on our project, apart from you being able to do mix Credo, for instance, which will run some code guidelines against your code, like I mentioned before. And once Credo completes, we can see that we have some complaints. This is mostly due to we don't have some documentation on some of the modules that we have on the project. It's no big deal. Yeah, so now we can start to actually do the changes for our UI. And the first thing I want to do is on the application CSS, I'm going to comment out this importing of the buttons because we're not going to use these buttons. And if we start our server once again, we can see that the colors for our button are gone. And another thing I'm going to do is add support for the Tailwind plugins, forms, and the typography that will give us some extra classes for things like headers and other text elements, and also format forms in a better way. So what we can do is go into package JSON here, and we can add a couple of dependencies for these plugins in particular. And then we just need to go into our assets folder and do npm install to make sure that we load them up into package.json.log. And then we just need to add them to the Tailwind CSS plugins, and we should be done. So I'm just going to start our server once again and go into Tailwind config. And here we can also add a few more things that I've added in the meantime. Namely, we want to set up purge to only be enabled if we are in production mode. So we don't want to purge any classes if we are in dev mode, which is basically a waste of time. And we also need to make sure this is actual content, and it's a list of the items that we want to purge as we had before. And I'm actually going to expand this a little bit with a few more cases that might or might not be covered by our previous options. And I also want to support some whitelisting here, namely anything PHX and top bar related. I don't want it to be purged. And finally, we only need to set up also the plugins that we just added. And I'm going to leave forms commented out for now. We're going to see if we're actually going to use it or not later when we create forms to create a room, for instance, and other things like that. So after this small initial configuration, we can finally create a migration to support our rooms. So what I'm going to do is mix ecto.gen.migration, and I'm going to add a new migration that creates the rooms table, and I'm going to call this create rooms. And this is the way you instruct Phoenix how to modify the structure of your database. In this case, we are going to create a new table called rooms, and the migrations live under priv repo migrations, in case you didn't know that. And what we're going to do here is, I'm just going to copy paste this piece of code that I have here. Basically creates a table in the database called rooms that belongs to a user. And we already have this table users in our database because it was created by the authentication generator. It has a name, a description, and an invite code that we can later send to our friends so they can join rooms that we have created. And then it just creates a unique index to make sure that the user cannot create more than one room with the same name. And that's pretty much it. So now if we go into the console, we can do make ecto.migrate, and Ecto will try to identify all the migrations that it has not run previously, and it will run them. And it keeps track of this in a special table in the database called Schema migrations, where it basically adds one entry to this table per migration that you have created. And this is how it keeps track of the current status of the structure of your database, basically what all the migrations that you have already ran in the past. So we have one new migration to run. We're going to run it, and we can see that create table rooms worked, creating the index worked. So now we have support for rooms in terms of our database. So I'm going to start our server again. And now we need to create a schema, which is going to be the in-code representation of a room. And the way we do this is we can go into lib honest chat. We can see that we have a context here for accounts, which is related to authentication. So we can create a new folder for our rooms context. And I'm actually going to create a new file here called room.ex. This is going to be our schema for the room. And again, I'm just going to copy paste the code because it would take way too much time to type it all, but I'm going to explain what this file basically means. This is the representation of a room in our database or in our code. It directly maps to a database row in the rooms table. And we can see that we are declaring the fields that we created for this table, namely name, description, invite code. And we are using some special macros to tell that this room belongs to a user, and we have to tell it what the user schema is so that Ecto behind the scenes knows how to connect the dots, so to speak. And then we have the change set function that represents a change on the database that we want to perform. It's going to be used to insert new rooms in the database, update room information, all that jazz. And we are adding some code level validations, like making sure that the name, description, and user ID are required fields, and that you cannot create a room without these fields. And we also have this special function that we created called maybe generate invite token. Maybe because we only want to generate invite token once when the room is created. And this is why this code checks if the room is new or is a new record on the database, or if it's an update, or if we want to force the generation of an invite code. And the invite code is nothing more than a random string of 10 characters, base 64 encoded. And now we need to create a context module to support our room operations in the database. So I'm just going to create a new file here called rooms.ex, analogous to accounts.ex, which manages things related to authentication, like getting a user by email or registering a new user or things like that. So in our rooms, we're going to have like the code equivalents of our database queries to perform operations in terms of rooms. And again, pasting the code here, this is nothing more than a simple module that imports Ecto queries so we can perform queries on the database, and also aliases the room schema and the repository, and then has three functions: get user rooms, which, as the name implies, returns all the rooms that belong to a particular user, getting a room based on the ID of that room, and creating a new room based on some attributes. And you can see that we are using the change set function that I talked about before here for the insert, and we're also going to use it later, for instance, for updates on a room's attributes. So now let's start working on our first live view, and for that I will need to go to our router, our Phoenix router, and specify an entry point for this. And we can see that the scope for the slash, or the base directory of our URL structure, is pointing to the honest chat web module. And then we have a page controller that deals with slash. So if you would go to, I don't know, say honestchat.com / you would go into this page controller and call this function on the index. But this is not what we want. We actually don't want to use a traditional controller from Phoenix. We're going to use a live view. So we're just going to use this special macro live that still maps to the slash base URL, but instead points to an index view under this module structure that we're going to create. And it's just a matter of creating the folder live, and then we can create a file called index view. And a live view in its essence, it's basically the code that I just pasted here. It has a mount function that is called whenever the live view is initially mounted on the browser. And then it has a handle params function that is called every time new parameters are passed to that live view. And then finally has a function called render that basically renders whatever you want to render on the browser. And if we take a look at our browser right now, we can see that our slash, so our base URL, is now rendering the live view correctly. We're just rendering hello world, but for now, that's what it is. Now, there's one important subject that we need to address, and it's related with the authentication. So when we use traditional Phoenix controllers and the normal HTTP request response cycle, so not using LiveViews, one thing that the authentication generator did for us was set up this user auth plug that is inside the router, and you can see the import here. And it basically gives us this plug fetch current user. And we can take a look at that real quick. It basically will make sure that the session of the user contains the authenticated user, and injects that current user into the connection. Since we are using LiveViews, from the point where a LiveView is mounted on the browser, all the communication between the client and the server occurs via WebSockets. So there's no longer the traditional HTTP request response cycle, which means that this assign current user is lost in the process. And one way we can get around this is by using the new mechanism LiveSession that was introduced in LiveView 016, if I'm not mistaken. And that allows us to, when a LiveView is mounted on the browser, we can insert some assigns into the socket. Like we are doing here for the con, we can also inject this current user into the socket. And then from then on, the LiveViews instantly know if the current user is logged in or not and who he is, which is important. So let's try to do that. We can go to our router and we can wrap our LiveViews in a live session. And I can show you exactly what this will look like. We can just do, let's get rid of this comment for now. We can just do something like this. We have a live session, we give it a name, and we say that on mount. So basically every time there is a live session being started for these live views that we are putting here, we want to call this other live view. This is a special kind of live view where you can define these hooks plug into the live view cycle. We do this, and then we need to create our live, what I call it, live auth. And this is pretty much a live view, but it implements this special function. And what this is going to do is going to allow us to get the user token that is already on the session, because when we authenticate, it gets put on the session by the normal code that was generated by the authentication generator. Then we can take this token and use the accounts context to see which user this is based on the token. And if it's a real user, meaning that the token is valid, we can assign this current user to the socket and becomes available for the live views. And if it's not, we just redirect the guy to the login page, basically, so we can log in. And in the case that it doesn't even have this user token on the session, so it doesn't pattern match on this clause here, it pattern matches on this one, we instantly redirect to the user's login as well, which means that now that we have this, if we go back to our browser, we should see the login screen, because we were trying to access a live view that was protected and we never logged in. And this ties up really nicely into our next step, which is to basically restyle this thing, like the login screen, for instance, especially. And let's start by getting rid of this header, because it doesn't bring anything good for us right now. So let's just go to templates, layout, root, and I think we can pretty much remove everything from here and just leave inner content. But you know what? Let's leave the navigation because we might want it later, but let's just remove everything else. So let's leave this. We can also remove this. Let's leave it like this, the way to comment out things, and we can get rid of this Phoenix logo as well, because we don't really care about it. And if we look at our code now, it looks much better. Now we can restyle this thing here. And this particular page for the login lives under user session new. Login is another word for creating a new session on the browser. That's why the nomenclature is like this. And I'm not going to go and explain what I did here, but I went into the website, one of the websites that I was talking about in the beginning, Tailwind components, I think. And I got this awesome login page. That's actually the name that it has. And I adapted it to work with this form that we have here to do the registration, to do the session login, and to put the register links and forgot your password and all that. And you can see the final code on GitHub. Don't worry, follow along. There's a lot of Tailwind classes here to make this look good. And if we save this and go back to our browser, we can see that now we have a proper kind of login page. And I'm not sure I already registered it in here. I think I did, but let's see if I did. No, I did not. So let's register. Oh, and the register screen is also messed up. So let's also change that one. And this one lives under user registration new. And we can also get that from my other project here. And there we go. So register, we're going to register. Please don't email me. Okay, we created our user and we can see that we got redirected to the correct live view. Now we also want to stylize this one. So what we are going to do is go into our live, if I can find it here, and we're going to take out this hello world. I'm going to paste some code here and I'll explain. So this plane is just going to be a giant container for a couple of components. And in case you don't know, live components are similar to live views. The main difference between them, there are more, but the main difference between them is that a live view has an associated process on the virtual machine. So every live view has one process that is connected to a browser somewhere on the user endpoint, but it has a process running on the Erlang virtual machine. And components are more like a way for you to extract HTML pieces into other modules, but they still share the same process as the live view that is rendering them. As you can see here, I have created a couple of components, one for the sidebar and one for the messages part. I am giving them identifiers. This makes sure that they are proper stateful components that can handle some state and can also handle like events being triggered inside of them. And for the sidebar component, I'm passing in the current user that we already know that the live session is injecting into our live view. And we need to also alias these components so we don't forget. And now we can create some components here. So let's start with sidebar. I am going to copy paste it here. New file sidebar.ex. The main difference here is that there is no mount because only live views are mounted, but there is an update. So every time a live view updates some state that is related to a component, it's going to trigger a re-render of that component. So it triggers this update and the re-render. And we are accepting the current user. As we saw before, the live view is passing in the current user. We are also going to try to get all the rooms for this particular user. And then on the render, we can show some header information on the sidebar. We can also show links to login and to go into the settings that we had before. And we can also list a few user rooms. So let's save this file. Let's create the messages component. And the messages component for now is very simple. I have some Tailwind code copied here just because I'm going to reuse it later as we continue to move along in the project. But for now, the render of this component is pretty much just the name and the description of this room. You might notice that I defined a couple of render functions here. One, when the room is nil. So every time I open the page and I'm not in a room, I want to show something different than when I'm in a room. When I'm not in a room, I just want to show this message saying, yeah, if you want to join a room, click on the sidebar on the left. And if I am in the room, I want to show the room name and description. There's also a couple of updates. One for the room when the room ID is nil, one with the room ID is actually a proper value. And in that case, I'm going to retrieve the room from our rooms context. Let's give it a try. Okay, it's complaining current room ID is not available in templates. I think it's because I am passing in the current room ID into here, but I did not define it in the beginning on the live view. So we can go into the live view and define it as nil, and that should trigger our layout to appear. So this is the sidebar. It has links. It has a list of rooms. There are no rooms yet. And because there are no rooms yet, the messages part, which is this big block here, says no room has been joined yet. Join a room, click on its name. So we don't have any rooms. We can't see anything right now, but it's very easy to create a room. We can go to our console and we can do something like, let's say, honest chat.rooms.create room, and then we can pass in a list of arguments. We can pass in name first room. We can pass description, this is my first room, and we need to pass in a user ID. I don't know the user ID yet, but I think it's probably 1 because we just created our first user on the database, so I reckon it's going to be 1. If it's not, we can give it a try with user 2 or something like that. So doing this, we just created a room, and you can see that the invite code was actually also generated. So this is good. It's working. And if we go back here and we refresh, we don't see any rooms because I think I already had one user before. What we can do is create another room for user 2, and hopefully that will show our room here. So all this is working. It's already retrieving from the database. We still don't have a UI to create a room here, but it's on their way. And now one thing we can do here is if we take a look at the sidebar, you might have noticed that I have a link here on the room name. So this is actually a link, even though the mouse cursor is not the usual hand cursor, but that's fine. And you can see that if I click it, I'm going to trigger an event called enter room. And if you don't specify a PHX target for this event, it's actually going to trigger on the live view that is rendering this component. In this case, it's going to be the index view. So if we put here a handle event function to handle this event, and the signature is the name of the event that we were triggering, and then there's an event with some data, in this case, the ID, and this comes directly from this PHX value ID. This first part is like, it's you saying that this event is going to have some value, and this is the identifier of the value, and it gets translated into ID and something. And that's why I'm pattern matching here against ID and room ID. And then I can take this and I can do assign the current room ID to room ID. And this will internally make LiveView re-render the messages with the proper room ID. So if we save this, in theory, if I click here, I should see the beginning of my new room as if we just joined it. Pretty cool, right? And it's like instantaneous. It's like magic. So yeah, that's the beginning of the UI for our Honest Chat application. On the next one, we're going to continue. We'll probably create the form to create new rooms because that's important, right? We don't want to have to create them via the console. Maybe also start thinking about how to publish messages and then show them to various people that are on the same room. So until next time, cheers. If you like this video, please consider subscribing and liking and sharing with your friends. It really helps the channel to grow. Thank you.